Mankind has produced a lot of military vehicles over the years, and many of these have gone on to become absolute legends of their period. Equifamous to any politician, any general. However, for every Tiger or T-34 of the world, there are 10 other models that get none of the fame, none of the glory, and as a result end up slipping through the cracks of the historical zeitgeist to sit gathering dust and just languishing in obscurity for apparently time immemorial. And if we do say so ourselves, this is a dire shame because these vehicles, unloved and overlooked as they are no less interesting for that fact. So join us today as we shine our torch deep into that darkness and bring you the stories of 5 forgotten military vehicles. Alright, let's begin our first chapter by saying something most unexpected. Italy, a nation commonly written off as a technological underdog during World War I, was actually a bit of a pioneer of tanks. Sort of. It would be more accurate to say that they were pioneers of the idea of the tank, as they were one of the first to realise that a big armoured bang-bang box might be an idea most big and most clever in the seemingly never-ending meat grind that was that particular war. But the actual execution of that idea into a finalised, ready-to-deploy weapon system, well, that proved to be something that they were, let's just say less pioneering with. The story begins in 1915, when Major General Giulio Martini tasked Fiat, the very same Fiat that continues to produce cars to this day, make my mum's car, the Fiat 500, with creating a 40-ton armoured vehicle that sported a 65mm main gun and heavy armour, which when completed was to be known as the Type 2000 armoured assault car. This became shortened to just the Fiat 2000 in official nomenclature, so 4 of my mum's car. This was really early in the tank story. Bear in mind that Little Willie, the first ever tank, was only completed in September 1915, and you suddenly see what we mean. Italy really was on the cutting edge of things for a time. So, you might be wondering, well, what gives then, Simon? How come the Fiat 2000 didn't roll out of the factory a few months later and secure its place in history as one of the earliest tanks, and more broadly, Italy's place in the history books as one of the big tank pioneers? Well, in a nutshell, it was ungodly amounts of heel dragging and faffing about on the part of Ansaldo, an industrial giant that Fiat had contracted out production of the 2000's armour to. Now, the specifics of this faff fest are somewhat below the abstraction layer for us today. It's lots of legalese, bickering, stuff like that. Don't worry too much about it. The one key detail to note from all of this is that when this spat was done, and the 2000's armour was finally shipped off to Fiat, it was now early 1917, leaving Italy way behind in tank design. The first prototype was not completed until mid-1917, with significant portions such as the upper structure remaining unfinished, and it would take until early 1918 until work on a second fully completed prototype was finished. As for its final design, as per the second prototype, power came from a rear-mounted Fiat A12 aviation engine which delivered 250 horsepower. Not a terrible figure when you consider that a 1917 vintage British Mark IV only put out 105 horsepower. It also had a pretty smart internal layout for its time, because it put the crew and the engine in separate compartments, which were split up by a thick bulkhead. This was intended to lessen the dangers posed by smoke intoxication and fire hazards, both things that were big problems on many early tanks. On top of all of that sat the very unique dome-shaped turret, inside of which there was a 65mm Modello 13 cannon, just as demanded by Martini's original brief. Interestingly, however, as this was a howitzer rather than a true cannon, it had a notable dead zone close to the tank where it simply couldn't aim. Furthermore, the second prototype also sported 6 Fiat Revelli Modello 1914 machine guns that bristled out at all angles to create a full arc of fire around it. As for armour, the 2000 had plates up to 20mm thick. Now, this doesn't sound like much by the standards of modern tanks, but consider that the Mark IV had a maximum thickness of just 12mm, and it really doesn't look that bad at all, does it? It was able to happily deal with machine gun and rifle fire, and even some of the lighter anti-tank weaponry of the day. As you may have already guessed from our referencing the second prototype as the 2000, no further units were built, and it was never properly adopted. Largely, this was down to Italy's adoption of the Renault FT in the form of the indigenously produced Fiat 3000 in 1921. It was cheaper, and it was available now, so its adoption over the still not finalized 2000 was considered a bit of a no-brainer by the powers that be. The 2000s did see some action, however, as it is known that a second prototype was deployed to Libya in the 1920s, but it is unknown if it saw combat. They were also paraded about by Mussolini as propaganda tools in the 1930s and used as training vehicles from time to time. As for their ultimate fate, well, it's actually currently unknown. They were last spotted in 1939, and then they just disappeared. For our next forgotten military vehicle, we present to you this thing, which is known, depending on who you ask, as either Kahn's Obstacle Ball or the Rolling Fortress tank, and it was the brainchild of a Polish-born engineer living in British Mandatory Palestine during World War II, who history remembers only as Mr. L. Kahn. It was one of the many proposals that he submitted during the war, and can you believe it, the totally normal and grounded design didn't progress beyond the preliminary sketch stage because it was not grounded at all. As per his designs, Kahn envisioned his invention as a giant armored ball with a diameter that was either just over 6 meters or just over 15 meters, with walls that were 0.5 meters thick on the smaller ball and just over 1 meter thick on the bigger one. As for what said ball was to be constructed from, well, that would be old-school iron-reinforced concrete. As for how it actually construct the thing, well, nobody knows. Longtime tank author Andrew Hill speculates that Kahn likely envisioned the ball as being made from 2 separately cast halves that would be subsequently bolted together. He also speculates as to how heavy it would have been. 123 tons for the smaller ball and wait for it, absolutely mind-blowing 1,800 tons for the larger 15-meter version. Safe to say, these weights, especially the larger one, may have made the obstacle ball just a tad impractical. As for what the hell Kahn wanted to put inside the thing, his design included an internal free-floating car of sorts that would be connected to the outer shell via steel pins. As this was free-floating, crew, weaponry, and stores could all remain inside while it moved around. Do note, however, due to it being connected via a single set of pins, it would only remain stable-ish if moving directly forwards or backwards. Any sideways moving and the poor souls inside would be dodging flying material and bringing up the breakfast they got out of their ration pack that morning. When it came to moving it about, it was to be towed, as it had no engine of any sort. For the smaller ball, Kahn proposed a bespoke carriage trailer towed by a normal truck. This was nothing if optimistic, given the fact that the AEC Matador, one of the British Army's go-to trucks during the war, could tow just shy of 7 tons in its standard version, or just shy of about 9 tons if it was the beefed-up 3-axle model. And remember, that thing weighed 1,800 tons. Also, Kahn pictured multiple balls being towed behind one truck. As for the larger model, well, apparently he wanted the same thing. And yeah, he thought this would work for the small model and the large model. But of course, here a second hurdle presents itself, because not only is 1,800 tons heavier than what most railway locomotives of the day could tow, but it's also wider than most roads. If you happen to be wondering how this thing was meant to be used, Kahn saw it doing exactly what it said on the tin, acting as a giant portable fortress that could be plonked in various places as and where the need was most pressing on the battlefield. Interestingly, this idea was tried elsewhere, with a notable example being the Bison concrete armored lorry, but unlike the Rolling Fortress, the Bison kinda actually worked on account of it not being so heavy that Hercules himself would struggle to nudge it along. In fact, forget Hercules, Atlas wouldn't be able to lift this shit. Beyond just his Rolling Fortress, Kahn submitted a bunch of other wacky Wallace and Gromit-esque inventions to the Ministry of Supply, with notable examples being electrified artillery shells and landmines, propellers that could be bolted to the side of ships and spin at 10,000 RPM to break up incoming torpedoes, and an anti-submarine death ray. We're not joking. Shockingly, none of these ideas were ever adopted. Next on this list is something much more normal, a good old-fashioned tank hunter, just one that was built in such small numbers that you likely haven't heard of it, the TACAM R2. It was built by Romania during World War II and had just 21 units produced during a single short 1944 production run. It started out life as a Czech LT-35 light tank, which Romania ordered 126 of in 1936, calling them the R2 in their service. These were still going strong come World War II, and so they naturally found their way to the Eastern Front. There, they just about held their own for a time, but come the close of 1942, with Soviet big boys such as the T-34 and the KV appearing in ever larger numbers, it had become clear that they had outstayed their welcome on the front lines. This presented the Romanians with a dilemma. Well, what were they going to do with the old chassis? They were dependable enough machines, to be sure, just ones that weren't cutting edge anymore. If only there was a way to make them viable once again. Well, luckily, the Germans had found a way to do exactly that, because they had started taking tiny old tanks, cutting the turret off, plonking a big gun on top, and repurposing them as tank destroyers that engaged enemy armor at nice long distances, where their chances of their thin armor being blown apart by an incoming shell was comparatively minimal. For examples of this, think of the Marder 1, which saw a PaK-40 cannon plonked on a French Lorraine 37L chassis, and the Marder 3, which saw the same gun bolted onto a Czech LT-38 chassis. Inspired by that, the Romanians then set about hunting for a gun that they could use, and to spare their already buckling industry, they settled for a captured gun that they had lying around in huge numbers, the Soviet ZIS-3. With all of that settled, conversion work began in February 1944. This saw the old Czech chassis having their new gun mounted on a custom pedestal, which was then partially enclosed within a three-sided, ever so slightly roofed casemate that was made using salvaged armored steel taken from captured Soviet T-26 and BT-7 tanks. This naturally gave it a differing thickness, 10mm for the steel taken from the BT-7 and 17mm for that taken from the T-26. This was just about enough to fend off small arms fire, but nowhere near enough to deflect any sort of cannon fire from that period. But this wasn't seen as a detriment. It kept it light, it kept it nimble, and thus it allowed it to take shots from a distance and scarper before anything too scary could be sent its way in return. What was a detriment, however, was the gun, as during testing in late 1943, it was found that while the original chassis could happily take the gun's weight, it was only effective against T-34s at 500 to 600 meters. Despite this, however, they pushed on with development, because while it was by no means perfect, it still did the job. The crews just had to be careful to use it right. The conversion work came to an end in June 1944, with a single batch of 20 having been upgraded, and they were all immediately sent out to the front lines. It was also redubbed on account of its extensive conversion, becoming the TACAM R2, TACAM being an acronym for the Romanian translation of anti-tank gun on R2 mobile gun carriage. As for their combat record, we know that 12 were tasked with defending against Axis counterattacks from Hungary in September 1944 after Romania switched sides, and by all accounts, it performed well enough, being deployed intelligently and easily being able to handle Panzer IIIs, 4s, and even the odd Panther if the winds of fortune blew the correct way. We also know that in early 1945, 12 of them found themselves assigned to the 2nd Armoured Regiment and sent to Czechoslovakia, although most of them ultimately ended up being swapped by the Soviets for German armour, with their ultimate fate being unknown. We know that two had survived both destruction and Soviet curiosity come April 1945, as they were documented as being in action around Brno, but come 1945 they had been lost somehow as the regiment returned to Bucharest without them. Today, only one survives, the initial prototype, which was held back and not sent to the front lines. It can be found in the National Military Museum in Bucharest, and we recommend a visit if you happen to be passing. It's pretty bloody cool. Next, we have the Tank Tip A. And no, you didn't hear us wrong there. We did say Tank Tip A, T-E-N-K. Also known as Vehicle A, it's a Cold War-era Yugoslav tank that was born as a result of Joseph Tito telling Stalin to shove his demand to join the Eastern Bloc up his chutney, as he would be going it alone and didn't want any meddling from Moscow. This gave Tito a problem when it came to armoured vehicle production, as Yugoslavia had been very dependent upon Soviet military aid, and with his refusal to join Stalin's bloc, no more would be coming Tito's way. Naturally, they'd have to build their own. But how? A special commission was formed in 1948 to answer that very question, and they quickly arrived at two options for Vehicle A, as it had come to be known. Improve the existing T-34-85 or start from scratch and design something big and tarty. As Yugoslavia wasn't exactly paved with gold in those days, they ended up choosing the former option. With a general idea outlined, it was then kicked down to the people who knew what they were doing, with all three of Yugoslavia's operable tank workshops pooling their best talent for the task before them. In command of it all was a fellow by the name of Major Anton Kurt, who, thanks to his previous experience converting tanks during World War II, was a no-brainer choice. It took 14 months of blood, sweat and tears, but eventually 5 Vehicle A prototypes were ready for evaluation. They were still fundamentally T-34-85s as per the brief, but ones that varied massively in their armament and design minutiae. For example, they retained the original ZIS-53 gun, but incorporated improving mounting hydraulics, a muzzle brake, and a pinch German TZF sights that offered greater magnification. Further to that, they also featured 2 MG-42 machine guns and an M2 heavy machine gun for aircraft defense. And as the eagle-eyed tank enthusiasts among you have no doubt noticed, the turret also changed quite a bit, with it now having a rounded, almost T-54 or IS shape going on. That's no coincidence either, as the most basic idea was straight up lifted from the Soviets, although the sources differ on which exact tank was the inspiration. Its armor also differed substantially from a standard T-34-85, having frontal armor of 50mm as compared to the normal 45mm, and a general thickness of 20 to 100mm as compared to 30 to 80. Power came from an indigenously produced V12 diesel engine that put out 400 horsepower at the crank, pretty much dead on the same as a standard T-34-85. However, unlike the standard variant, which had most of its engine's reliability issues worked out come the end of World War II, Vehicle A's engine was a tad duff, to put it mildly, mostly owing to the low-grade metals used in their construction. It's also a similar story with the transmission, which again had been largely sorted out in the standard T-34-85 come the end of World War II, but in Vehicle A it harkened back to the old days of Operation Barbarossa, where awfully made T-34s could sometimes only be coaxed into a new gear with a firm application of a lump hammer. In light of these issues, further production of Vehicle A was canned, and development never progressed beyond those initial prototypes. Yugoslavia did get some use out of them, however, as parade vehicles, with them making their public debut in a military parade held in Belgrade on the 1st of May 1950. The fate of the 5 prototypes varied. One vehicle was sent to the Kalemegdan Military Museum in Belgrade, where it remains to this very day, and again, if you happen to be in town, it's pretty cool, check it out. The rest were used either as gate guardians or as range targets, and as far as we know, none of those survive today, long having either been cut up for scrap or blown apart. Another weird one to finish us off today, the VXO amphibious half-track. This one is a duality of the bizarre, as it is both a half-track designed in 1998, way after they had fallen out of vogue following World War II, and also because it partially has its roots in, of all places, Liechtenstein. You know, that tiny European micronation with the population of a small town. It gets weirder still, though, because it was the brainchild of Finnish inventor Klaus Rantala, someone who has basically no paper trail to follow and is basically a complete enigma. And VXO, Liechtenstein-based company that submitted its patent documents, doesn't appear to have ever actually existed, seemingly just being a holding company with a postbox and a business center for tax purposes. So, why was it done this way? Long story short, God only knows, but Andrew Hill speculated on the matter, saying, quoting here, "This may have been used to assist in preventing claims or complaints against his filing, or simply to help make the application more accessible to a potential customer." From that then, you're probably expecting it to be a complete nonsense design. Right? We mean, come on, an unknown inventor filing patents via a company that doesn't really exist for a type of vehicle long since written off as obsolete? But, well, actually, no. The design appears to be pretty legit. Quoting Hill again here, "It's clear from the patent that he was at least mechanically and automotively knowledgeable to more than just an amateur degree." So, what did he design then? It features a fully enclosed armoured body with a tracked rear section and wheeled front steering. So far, so normal for a half-track. Its design also has armoured internal bulkheads that separate the engine and transmission from the crew and cargo spaces in the name of protection. Further to that, the hull also has a V-shape to improve mine resistance, while also using composite armor assembled with tongue and groove joints for strength. The turret design has 2 long-barreled weapons, though Arentala doesn't tell us exactly what he had in mind, with a low-profile angular design to minimize frontal exposure. Then there are its amphibious capabilities, which called for a very specifically designed air and water channel system to enhance water performance. As described by Arentala, to stop the engine being flooded, the whole vehicle drew air from intakes mounted high up in front of the turret, and further still, it was also designed with channels through the side, which would have air fed through them and thus create a pocket of air that would further improve buoyancy. As for how it actually moved through the water, that was to be achieved through a simple impeller system that took water and pushed it out rearwards. And that's about all we know for this one. There's no evidence of it ever progressing beyond the blueprinting and patenting stage, no pitches to defense contractors, no public campaigns to drum up publicity and business, no further patents. Nothing. And we've seen some pretty bizarre vehicles on this channel over the years, but this one may just have raised the bar to a whole new height.